everyone, welcome to the third episode of Dollar Dialogue. Today we are going to discuss a very important topic, which is the impact of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict on the global economy. Today with me we have Arif Malik and Shazib Karim, and we would also like to welcome our special guest speaker, Mr. Parth Sharma. Parth is a economics HL student at our school in AISD, and he is actually an IBDB economics HL student, and he's one of the most hardworking and most dedicated student I've ever seen. And Fard, would you like to add anything to the introduction?
Yes, thank you for the introduction. I'm Parth Sharma. I go to the same school as Araf, Arib, and Shazib. I'm in Araf's class for most of my subjects. We're in the same grade. I attend HL, Econ, English, and Business. And I'm just very honored to be here today to talk about this topic, which is quite an interesting topic. And I'm just hoping to have a good conversation.
Parth, thank you for the introduction. Now, as Parth has highlighted, he's an economics HO student for the IBDB program, and I would agree with him that he's one of the most hardworking and most dedicated students at our school, and especially for economics. Now, moving on to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Russian-Ukrainian conflict goes back to 2014, but we're gonna primarily focus on things that have happened after 2021. So in 2021, in around March and April, Russia started gathering tens of thousands of troops near the Ukrainian border, which obviously raised international alarms about a possible invasion. And this was not the start of the conflict. The start of the conflict was actually in February 24, 2022. But 3 days before that, in February 21, 2022, Russia recognized the independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic in eastern Ukraine. And then in 3 days after, in February 24, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and they launched a full-scale attack with airstrikes and ground troops. And the invasion was obviously met with international condemnation. And obviously the West, they didn't want to engage in a direct full-out war with Russia. So that's why they resorted to another sort of intervention, which was economic sanctions. And then moving on in March 2022, obviously Russia started advancing in eastern Ukraine. And in May of that year, in May 2022, Russia had taken full control of Mariupol, or they claimed to have taken full control. And then in 2023, the war kept going on, and Russia is still in eastern Ukraine. They're controlling some areas, and the war is still going on in 2024. And we are going to primarily focus on the impact of the war on the global economy. Arif or Parth, would you like to highlight anything or add anything to the information that I've said?
Sure. I'd like to say that Putin was definitely like ignited the war when he basically ordered Russian troops to invade on February 24th. And I think since the Russians' invasion of Ukraine of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, Putin seems to have like seek more, like kind of ask himself why not go further, and this is kind of the reason why he invaded Ukraine in February 24th. And I think this was he kind of wanted to restore what he calls the Russian world, and yeah, that's basically it. He wanted to kind of restore what he calls the Russian world. That's why he kind of conducted the Russian troops to invade on February 24th.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Parth over here. Like, I think I agree with Parth. Like, Putin sort of had this plan since 2014 to sort of annex and take over the entire Ukraine, and I would definitely agree on Parth here. And I would also like to say that since the war started on 24 February 2022, this invasion has become the largest attack on a European country since World War II, and I think this also speaks volume to the large social impact that this war has, not just economically speaking.
Thank you, Arif and Parth, for sharing your opinion.
Yeah, one more thing. I also think that
Sure, Parth.
Putin, this attack of Russian troops to invade on February 24th did not go according to Putin's plan, and he was quite probably expecting it to be like a quick, easy, and short victory. But as you can see, things have not gone to planning. Quite seriously miscalculated.
Thank you, Parth and Ari, for sharing your opinion. Now let's move right into the discussion for today, which is the impact of the Russian-Ukraine conflict on the global economy. The first economic impact that I would like to talk about is the rising energy prices and the disruption in the energy market. And before the start of the conflict in 2022, Russia exported around 7.8 million barrels of crude oil and petroleum products per day, which represented 12% of the global oil trade. And following the outbreak of the conflict and subsequent sanctions, oil prices obviously spiked, and I believe that's a spike to around $120 per barrel in March 2022. And obviously, the spike in oil prices contributed to global inflation, and this obviously increased the transportation and production cost across industries. For instance, airlines and shipping companies faced higher fuel costs, which led to higher prices for goods and services. And as we live in Bangladesh, we have also seen the prices of fuel go up in our country as well. I remember that 2 years ago, the price of one liter of octane or petrol in Bangladesh was around 86 taka per liter. Now it's around 120, 30 taka per liter, if I'm not mistaken. And that was an enormously increase in price for a country like Bangladesh, where it's a growing, a developing country. And obviously, that sharp increase in price obviously did not it wasn't something that the people were expecting, and it obviously sent like economic shockwaves across the country, because people were realizing now, if they before it took them 1,000 taka to travel 100 kilometers, let's say, now it's going to take them 1,500 taka, which was obviously a lot of money. And Bart and Ari, would you like to add anything to this?
Yarov, I think it's a really good point that you have brought up. Russia is in fact the world's second largest producer of natural gas behind the United States, and I think this speaks volume. The Russian invasion on Ukraine not only impacted European countries who Russia exports natural gas to, mainly Germany, Turkey, but this has also impacted developing countries like Bangladesh, like India, and other developing countries around the world. If I'm not mistaken, the Russian since the invasion of Ukraine, more specifically in 2022, the natural gas prices has risen by well over 45% globally, and this shows that this hampers not only the Ukrainian and Russian economy, but also the global economy, as the rising prices in oil and natural gas means that everything else also has to rise, and therefore this is really impacting negatively the developing countries.
Bart, would you like to highlight anything or add anything to the things that Arif and I have said?
I think you guys have basically summed it up perfectly, but yeah, this conflict really impacted natural gas. As Arif said, Russia is quite a big supplier of natural gas. And yeah, you guys summed up perfectly. This conflict affects affected the natural gas prices all over the world, and led to basically inflation of the prices.
Thank you for the things that you have said. And as Arif has highlighted, that European countries were not the only countries that were impacted, but I would say the majority of the economic impact when it came to energy, when it came to the energy industry, was probably faced by Europe in general, because I believe that European countries previously imported around 40% of their natural gas from Russia, and after the invasion, they obviously had to look to other countries. And I believe that then European countries started importing natural gas from other countries such as the US and Qatar, and this obviously led to the transition of the global energy, I would say, hierarchy, where Russia was the leader for Europe. Now it was countries like Qatar and the US. And the shift obviously came with challenges such as the need for new infrastructure, because Russia and Europe obviously had infrastructure built in, but this shift obviously called for new infrastructure to be built. And also the EU's the natural gas imports in the first after the conflict were like 75% higher than in the before the conflict, which just shows that the demand for natural gas in the EU also went up. and they needed new countries to provide them with the natural gas with. And for this reason, I believe they looked to countries like the US and Russia. And obviously, this impacted the global economy, because if you look at the sharp price in the energy in the sector, as we have talked about, this obviously sent shockwaves across other industries, as people had to look for other ways to send their products through, and most of the time they didn't have other ways. It was through planes, ships, or cars, and the cost of running this planes, ship, and cars went up because the price of fuel went up. That means the price that people had to pay for the products obviously went up. Now, is there anything you would like to highlight, Ari, Shazib, or Part, to the information that I've just said?
Another interesting fact is that there's also like you've been talking about the how it affected the countries economically, but also economically, the sanctions imposed on Russia by the West have led to shifts in global trade patterns, because many countries have had to find new sources for imports and exports, which I know you have already mentioned. But this fact has realigned some international relationships and trade agreements. And I think on a diplomatic level, the conflict has tested international laws and norms, and I think it's been a significant challenge for the United Nations and other international bodies which strive to maintain peace and security. And I'd say that the effectiveness of international sanctions and diplomatic negotiations have been under scrutiny.
Thank you, Shazib, for sharing your thoughts on this matter. Ari or Part, would you like to add anything to it?
Yeah, Ralph, I think it's a really good point that Shazib has brought up here. The diplomatic repercussions of the Ukraine-Russian war, it truly is on a huge, exorbitant scale, because the it's sort of a polarizing issue. Many countries sort of had to be on Russia's side or on the Ukrainian side. Personally, Bangladesh, I believe, majority of the time, Bangladesh either was neutral or sided a bit towards Russia. And I'm not political, but I would say like this causes this polarization is really impacting the global economy, because countries on the different poles don't necessarily want to trade with each other. And other than that, I would also like to highlight the fact that in Europe, for example, there was a huge pipeline called the Yamal Europe pipeline, and it closed because of the Russian-Ukraine war. And this shows that because of the Russian-Ukraine war, many infrastructure projects that connected natural gas from Russia to parts of Europe close because of the diplomatic issues and conflict. And therefore, I agree with Shazib that we need to tie diplomatic relationship back together, and so that countries don't face economic repercussions for this conflict.
Thank you for all the opinions that you have shared. Now let's move on to another important economic sector, which is the global food sector. And now, the impact of the Russian-Ukraine conflict also had a very large, I would say, effect on the global food sector, because Ukraine and Russia accounted for, I would say, like nearly 30% of the global wheat exports, and the conflict obviously disrupted this exports, and the global wheat prices went up and rising by over, I would say, like 50% following the months over after the conflict. And the countries that were highly dependent on imports from Ukraine and Russia for wheat, which is obviously one of the main components for foods, because wheat is used to make bread, biscuits, and other such of sorts of things. And this obviously this rise in price for wheat obviously had impact on countries such as Egypt, which had imported around 80% of its wheat from these countries, and they also went through critical shortages because of this. And the price hike not just in Egypt but in other countries which were also dependent on wheat from Russia and Ukraine, and I would say Bangladesh was also was dependent on Russia and Ukraine for some wheat, but not so much. Led to the rise in led to the increased bread prices in different countries around the world, and this contributed obviously to global food insecurity. And there was obviously some countries did see some protests because of the rising food prices. And would you like to highlight anything to the things that I've said about the global impact on the impact of the Russian-Ukraine conflict on the global food sector?
Yeah, so the conflict between Russia and Ukraine has like sent shockwaves through the global food system, and mainly impacting wheat production. And as they are like two major exporters of wheat. And disruptions to this agriculture operations due to the conflict and the war between these two have led to many uh, concerns about reduced wheat output, and this decrease in supply has a potential and did actually drive up the wheat prices worldwide, affecting the affordability and availability of this staple food for millions of people, which also contribute to the poverty of people in many countries. And additionally, disruptions to transportation and trade routes stemming from this conflict further has supply chain challenges and also leads to the shortages and price spikes in regions who are like heavily reliant on imported wheat. Yeah, it's like this is not even this is quite a big impact that has had on has a had a major impact on the global food system.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Part. Arif and Shazib, would you like to add anything to the information that Part and I have said?
Yeah, I'd say like what Parth said. I definitely agree with Parth because if you look at it, Russia and Ukraine, they're not just major players geopolitically. Like they're all, they're known as the breadbasket of Europe because together they account for about 30% of global wheat exports. So it shows that they're staple grain that feeds billions of people around the world, and I'd say that this effect on the world, like the timing of this couldn't be worse because like the world was already facing increased food security challenges due to the recent pandemic. And now with wheat supplies constricted, countries in the Middle East and North Africa, which have heavily depended on imports from Ukraine and Russia, they're like these countries are now like vulnerable. And I'd say that nations like Egypt, which is the world's largest wheat importer, they have been scrambling to secure alternative resources.
Thank you for all the information that Part and Shazib that you have shared. Now moving on to another important sector, which obviously is connected to the food sector, is the fertilizer sector. And this also, because of the Russian-Ukraine conflict, the fertilizer sector was also impacted, and this obviously was not good for the global economy. And Russia, I would say, is a top supplier of key fertilizers, and I think that they supply 70% of the. They used to supply 70% of the world's exported nitrogen, 90% of phosphorus, 19% of phosphorus, and 21% of potassium. And obviously the sanctions and the trade disruptions that were imposed by on Russia led to a sharp increase in fertilizer prices. For example, I would say in Bangladesh, urea prices doubled within a year after the conflict, and this high fertilizer cost obviously led to increased agricultural costs worldwide, and this obviously decreased the profits that farmers made. But the more important thing, it made food more expensive for people living in developing countries such as in Africa or in Asia, South Asia in general. And this obviously impacted the global economy because people were not able. Now people had to spend more on their food, which means they were not able to spend on other things, other goods and services. And for this reason, it obviously impacted the global economy in a very negative way. Part and Shazib or Ari, would you like to add anything to the information that I have just said?
Yeah, Raf, I think it's a really good point that you have brought up. I would say the fertilizer sector is often overlooked, but I would say like the Russian Ukraine conflict has, I would say, significantly impacted the global fertilizer sector. Much like how a storm disturbs a calm sea, and similar to that, the Russian Ukraine conflict has impacted the fertilizer sector. Russia, which is I believe one of the leading exporter of key fertilizers such as potash, phosphate, nitrogen, has seen its supply chains disrupted due to the global sanctions and trade restrictions. And this disruption has cascaded through the global markets, causing the fertilizer prices to soar like rockets. For instance, I have a chart in front of me right now. It says that the price of phosphate and rock more than doubled on the onset of the invasion in February 2022. And I think this speaks volume that the global fertilizer sector has been negatively impacted since the war, and the prices have soared like rockets. And this is not only impacting the countries, but I feel like this is impacting the farmers even more. In Bangladesh, for example, I've seen that I saw news recently in which the farmers are taking more and more loans. Why is that? And I feel like fertilizer is one of the reasons, because if the prices are so high, it negatively impacts the farmers as well, and I truly feel sorry for them.
Parth and Shazib, would you
Yeah.
like to? Yeah, Shazib, go on.
Yeah, I like what Arif has said. I'd completely agree with him. Arif, well said. And I'd like to say that the consequences of this have been immediate and severe, because fertilizer prices have skyrocketed since the conflict has begun, putting immense pressure on farmers around the world. And this increase in costs is not just an agriculture issue, it translates into higher food prices for consumers globally. And specifically, countries in Europe, Asia, and the Americas, which rely heavily on imports of Russian fertilizers, have been scrambling to find alternative resources. And I'd also like to mention that the fact on how it has impacted the developing countries, because also like many of these nations depend critically on affordable fertilizers for their agricultural sectors, and the rising costs mean that farmers in these regions might reduce the use of fertilizers, potentially leading to lower crop yields and increasing food insecurity.
Thank you, Shazib and Arif, for the opinions that you have shared. And now let's moving
Also,
on.
also, I would like
Yeah,
to
Parth,
say
go on.
the fertilizer prices before like all this happened, it was also rising late 2020 due to several factors, but it kind of declined during COVID-19 lockdowns, but rebounded in late 2020 2021 as restrictions were lifted and making crop prices rise. And then the outbreak of the war on February 2020 drove prices dramatically higher, and there were many uncertainties that arose about fertilizer exports from Russia and Belarus due to the conflict itself. New or expanded economic sanctions on the two countries, and disruptions in Black Sea trade routes also occurred. And since Russia is quite like a big, both Russia and Ukraine are quite um, have like quite significant disruptions in the fertilizer sector, which plays like a crucial role in supporting the global agriculture. And as major producers of natural gas, which is quite a key ingredient in fertilizer production, the tension that they've had between each other has directly impacted the availability and the cost of natural gas needed for making fertilizer.
Thank you, Parth and Arif and Shazib, for all the opinions that you have shared. Now let's moving on to another aspect of the impact of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict on the global economy, which is the rise in commodity prices, and that led to obviously inflation. And the conflict between Russia and Ukraine impacted the energy and food prices, as we have talked about. But they also impacted the rise in commodities that we have talked about, such as oil. But another thing that they impacted is nickel. Russia and Ukraine are both significant producers of industrial metals, which is nickel is one of it. And for instance, Russia produces 10% of the global nickel supplies, and that's a critical component for stainless steel and batteries. And nickel prices after the conflict saw extreme volatility, which means that it was fluctuating a lot in a short period of time, and the price doubled to a record $100,000 per metric ton briefly after the conflict. And this disruptions also affected the manufacturing sectors, particularly automotive and electronics. And this obviously led to increased production costs. And in some instances, in some smaller automotive and electronics company, this obviously led to higher retail prices for consumers. But at the end of the day, the rise in production costs for companies obviously meant that the company had to offset this cost somewhere. And in some cases, obviously, it was by firing workers, which was obviously unfortunate. And we see that the Russian-Ukrainian conflict on the global economy is not just something that's superficial, that's something happening in a, just on paper, or something that's happening just for big companies. It's also impacting the average people, like the simple middle class people everywhere, because as we have talked about the rising food prices, it meant that middle class people in several countries, such as in Egypt, were not able to eat as much as they were able to before the conflict, or had to offset some of their income from consumption. And obviously, the rise in the price of metals and the commodities obviously meant that manufacturing costs also went up. Parth, Arif, and Shazib, would you like to add anything to the information that I've said?
Yorav, I think it's a really good point that you have brought up. I would say commodities, like I think you mentioned $100,000 per metric ton of nickel is absolutely crazy, and this speaks volumes regarding the impact on commodity prices on the war on the globe as a whole. Other than that, I would also say that other than nickel, I would say the price of gold has also soared. The price of gold, which is often seen, like I would say, as a safe haven for asset in terms of geopolitical uncertainty, has soared a lot. For instance, the gold prices, I believe, spiked to over $2,000 per ounce in March 2022, reflecting the heightened demand during the crisis period. And beyond just precious metals, I would also say that the food industry has been negatively impacted as well. We talked about this earlier. Egypt, the world which exports majority of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine, faced a severe food insecurity. And other than that, I would also say like many African countries have also taken the toll for this war, because they rely on loans from Russia and China, I would say also. But many of the African countries, I would say, rely on loans from Russia. And given the fact that the war has the many countries have set embargoes and trade restrictions on Russia, this influx of loans from Russia has also decreased in African countries, who are, I believe, majority of them are underdeveloped or developing, and this has impacted them really negatively and hampered the economy, on top of the commodity prices that you have mentioned.
Thank you, Arif. Shazib or Parth, would you like to highlight or add anything to the information that Arif has just said?
Yeah. So you guys basically summed it up. But this Russia-Ukraine conflict has triggered significant disruptions in global commodity markets, affecting a range of essential goods like natural price gases, wheat prices, like you said, gold prices, and just also increased energy costs worldwide. And also has also affected rising fertilizer prices, which have impacted agriculture production costs and food security. These disruptions in energy, wheat, and fertilizer markets have also had ripple effects throughout the global economy, affecting consumer prices, agriculture production, and supply chains. And these interconnected of these commodities underscores the far-reaching consequence of geopolitical conflicts on essential goods, and quite and basically highlights the need for coordinated international responses in order to like suppress this war's impact on uh, basically to bring it back to basically to have global stability and food security, I would say.
Thank you, Arif, Parth, and Shazib, for all the things that you have shared today. Now, let's summarize all the things that we have discussed. Our topic today was the impact of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict on the global economy. In this podcast episode, we have discussed the impact of the rising energy prices on the global economy, and how the rising energy prices that were caused by the Russian-Ukrainian conflict sent the price of oil barrels and everything to go up. And this obviously meant that the high companies had to face higher production costs and higher transportation costs, which obviously increase the price of goods and services for people living in countries around the world. But for especially people living in developing countries, it was obviously a burden on their shoulder, because now they had to offset their income. They had to make sure that they had to ensure that they were consuming less products now, or less products and goods and services now, because the cost of everything went up, and obviously inflation went up because of the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Also, we talked about the impact on the energy sector in Europe, and how Europe used to import 40% of the natural gas from Russia, but after the conflict, they had to look for other countries such as the US and Qatar. And we have also talked about today the impact of the Russian-Ukraine conflict on the global food sector. We have talked about how the conflict increased the prices of fertilizers and how the price of fertilizers went up, which means the price of food in general went up. And this obviously meant that people again in developing countries had to offset their income somewhere. They had to take a bigger burden on their shoulder, because now they had to decrease their consumption somewhere, because now the prices of everything went up. Obviously the prices of wheat also went up because of the conflict. Finally, we also discussed the impact on the global commodity sector. For example, the prices of how nickel went up after the conflict. And obviously this meant that the automotive and the automotive sector and the electronic sector had to now see had saw increase in production costs, because Russia used to supply 10% of the global nickel supplies. But after the economic sanctions that were imposed on Russia by Europe, obviously the prices of everything went up for these companies. And obviously this meant all of the things that we've talked about, the increase in production costs. This means that the firms had to fire some of the workers. Obviously this obviously contributed to a higher this obviously contributed to people's negatively contributed to people's income, to nations' income in general, because now firms had to fire some of their workers because of the rising production costs. And this obviously meant that some people were not are not or are not are still were not or now right now are not still able to work because of the rising production costs. And we have also talked about the impact of the Russian-Ukraine conflict on Bangladesh, and how the prices of urea went up in Bangladesh, how the price of fuel went up in Bangladesh, such as petrol. I hope the audience today has enjoyed our episode, which was the impact on the Russian-Ukrainian conflict on different global economic sectors. And I would like to thank our honorable guest, Parth Sharma, for coming in to speak today. He's one of the most hardworking and dedicated economics HL students in our school. And Parth, I hope that you've enjoyed today's episode, and talking about the topics that we have talked about. And is there any last words you'd like to say, Parth?
Just thank you for having me. It's been an honor to have me. But could I ask you a question actually?
Sure, Parth.
What steps are international organizations like the IMF and World Bank taking to address this economic fallout from the conflict? Or Arif and Shazib can answer this if you have an answer. But this is a question I have.
Arif and Shazib, would you like to go first?
Would you please repeat it?
Sure. What steps are international organizations like the IMF and World Bank taking to address this economic fallout from the conflict?
Yeah, Part. I think it's a really good point that you have brought up here. The Ukraine Russian conflict is really one that is polarizing, and I would say the World Bank and IMF are more on the economic sector, that they have been involved. For example, the IMF has given loans to Ukraine, but other than that, I would say economic wise, they have obviously supported Ukraine substantially by helping them. But I would say most of the help, I would say, and aid would come from the UN, specifically in MUN as well. We have debated the Ukraine-Russian conflict in the Human Rights Committee, and majority of the help and aid that Ukraine is receiving is currently coming from the UN. But other than that, as specifically for IMF or World Bank, they have given out they are basically given out loans which is long term, and like Ukraine won't have to really pay them in the short term to help them, because war is expensive. Therefore, these loans are helping out Ukraine. And Shazib, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, and to add on to Arif, I definitely agree with him that the organizations like the IMF and the World Bank have been instrumental in providing financial assistance to Ukraine and neighboring countries affected by the conflict. And I'd say that this aid helps stabilize economies by supporting budgetary and bolstering financial systems. For instance, the IMF approved emergency funding for Ukraine to help meet its urgent balance of payment and the needs that they have. And also, to add on to this point, I'd also say talk about the humanitarian assistance, because if you look at it, various United Nations agencies, including the World Food Program and the UNHCR, are deeply involved in providing humanitarian aid. And this includes food aid, emergency shelter, and medical supplies to displaced populations within Ukraine and refugees in neighboring countries. So I'd say like these steps are part of a broader international effort to manage the immediate impacts of the conflict. And yeah.
Thank you, Parth and Ari, for all the things that you have shared. I agree with all the things that you have said. Obviously, the IMF and the World Bank are contributing positively to the conflict. I would say by contributing money to Ukraine, by supporting them humanitarianly, and by making sure that the Ukrainian people are able to make sure that they're not the IMF and World Bank are making sure that the Ukrainian people are not just left to die. They're making sure they're funding them through different programs, I would say. And not just the IMF and World Bank, but even the EU. I think the EU has donated the most amount of money to Ukraine. And I would say by donating this money, by donating this money, they're making sure that the Ukrainian people are living. Ukrainian people are receiving food. Some food at the same time they're receiving like basic human needs such as like housing, I would say, and even like electricity through the for donation that the EU institutions have given, in addition to the donations that Ukraine has received from the World Bank and the IMF. And again, Parth, thank you for coming in today. Is there any more questions that you have, Parth?
No, you did a wonderful job answering that. I would just like to say thank you for having me, guys. This was a wonderful experience, and just being able to talk to you guys about the impact of Russian-Ukraine conflict on global economy has expanded my knowledge, and I'm sure it has for the viewers as well. And I would just like to say that I hope you guys keep doing this, and the best of luck to you three. And for all the viewers watching this, make sure you go subscribe and watch our previous episodes if you haven't already.
Thank you, Parth. Thank you so much. Again, I hope the viewers have enjoyed our conversation about the impact of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict on the global economy. Thank you for listening to our today's episode, and we hope to see you next week.